On this day last year, the world didn't just lose a former president. It lost a humanitarian, a peacemaker, a builder, a teacher, a man who spent a century proving that empathy is a form of strength. Jimmy Carter was born October the 1st, 1924, and he left this world on this day last year. December the 29th, 2024. He lived a remarkable 100 years. Welcome back to This Time Last Year. Today we remember the death of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was a Democrat. He served as the 39th President of the United States from 1977 to 1981, winning the election as the Democratic nominee. On this day last year, December 29th, 2024, the world said goodbye to a man whose life stretched across a century of American history. Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, died at the age of 100 in his hometown of Plains, Georgia. He passed peacefully, surrounded by family, closing a life that began in the rural South during the Great Depression and ended in a world transformed by technology, conflict, and change. His death marked the end of an era, and the reaction was immediate, emotional, and global. News of his passing spread within minutes, and tributes poured in from every corner of the world. Presidents and prime ministers issued statements. Humanitarian organizations shared stories of his work. People who had never met him wrote about how his actions had touched their lives. Even those who disagreed with his politics acknowledged the rare consistency of his character. Carter had become something unusual in modern public life. A leader respected not for power, but for principle. His death triggered a wave of reflection on what leadership can look like when it's rooted in humility, empathy, and service. Carter's story began far from Washington. He grew up in a small farming community in rural Georgia, working long days on his family's peanut farm. That upbringing shaped him in ways that never left him. He learned discipline, patience, and the value of hard work. He learned what it meant to live simply and to take responsibility for others. Those values followed him into adulthood, into the Navy, into state politics, and eventually into the White House. Even as president, he carried himself with the modesty of someone who had never forgotten where he came from. When he ran for president in 1976, the United States was exhausted by scandal and distrust. Watergate had shaken the country's faith in government. Carter promised honesty, transparency, and decency. He spoke softly, but with conviction. He didn't pretend to be perfect, and he didn't try to charm his way into office. He simply offered integrity. And in that moment, it was exactly what the country wanted. He won the election and entered the White House determined to restore trust in government. His presidency was marked by enormous challenges. Inflation was rising. Energy shortages created long lines at gas stations. International tensions were escalating. Carter faced criticism from all sides, but he remained committed to doing what he believed was right, even when it was politically costly. His most enduring achievement came in 1978, when he brought Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem begin together at Camp David. After nearly 2 weeks of negotiations, they signed a peace agreement that remains one of the most significant diplomatic breakthroughs of the 20th century. Even critics of his administration acknowledged that Carter's persistence, patience, and moral conviction made that agreement possible. His presidency was marked by enormous challenges. Even critics of his administration acknowledged that Carter's persistence, patience, and moral conviction made that agreement possible. Even with these achievements, Carter's presidency was far from smooth, and he faced several major controversies that shaped public perception of his leadership. The most defining was the Iran hostage crisis, where 52 American diplomats and citizens were held hostage for 444 days. Carter spent months negotiating and even authorized a risky rescue mission. But the operation failed when helicopters malfunctioned and collided in the desert, killing 8 servicemen. The crisis dragged on until the final minutes of his presidency, and the hostages were released just after his successor was sworn in, a moment that deeply overshadowed his final days in office. At home, the country was struggling through an energy crisis that left Americans waiting in long lines for gas. Carter urged the nation to conserve energy in a televised address that became known as the Malaise speech, even though he never used the word. Many Americans felt blamed rather than reassured, and the speech became a symbol of national frustration. The economy added even more pressure, with inflation, unemployment, and interest rates all rising at the same time, a painful combination that critics labeled stagflation. Carter also faced backlash for his decision to boycott the 1980 Moscow Olympics after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Athletes who had trained their entire lives were devastated, and the move sparked debate about whether politics should interfere with sports. Even within his own party, Carter faced resistance. Senator Ted Kennedy challenged him in the 1980 Democratic primary, creating a rare and damaging internal fight that weakened Carter heading into the general election. These controversies didn't erase his accomplishments, but they shaped how many Americans viewed his presidency at the time. They also set the stage for what would become one of the most remarkable post-presidential transformations in American history. But the most remarkable part of Carter's legacy came after he left the White House. Instead of retreating into retirement, he reinvented what it meant to be a former president. Through the Carter Center, he dedicated decades to humanitarian work. He fought disease, promoted democracy, monitored elections, and advocated for peace in places most world leaders never visited. He traveled to conflict zones, remote villages, and struggling communities, not for attention, but because he believed every life mattered. His work helped nearly eradicate diseases like guinea worm, a very long parasitic nematode worm which lives under the skin of infected humans and other mammals in rural Africa and Asia. He strengthened democratic processes around the world and brought attention to human rights abuses that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Carter's post-presidential life became a second career, one defined not by power, but by compassion. He built homes with Habitat for Humanity well into his 90s. He taught Sunday school in his hometown church long after most people his age had slowed down. He spoke out for the vulnerable, the oppressed, and the forgotten. In 2002, he received the Nobel Peace Prize for his humanitarian efforts. It was a recognition not of political power, but of moral influence. A rare acknowledgement that a former president had done more for humanity after leaving office than many do while in it. Throughout his rise in national politics, Carter became a familiar face to Americans, in part because of his repeated appearances on the cover of Time magazine. He was reportedly featured 27 to 30 times, some during the 1970s, including during his years as governor of Georgia, and throughout his 1976 presidential campaign, when the national spotlight began to shift toward him as a new kind of political figure. After winning the election, he appeared again on the cover as the incoming president, and in early 1977, he was named Time's Man of the Year, a symbolic recognition of the hope many Americans placed in him as he prepared to take office. And then, decades later, following his death in 2024, Time honored him once more with a memorial issue reflecting on his century-long life and global impact. His marriage to Rosalind Carter was another defining part of his story. They were partners in every sense, in politics, in humanitarian work, in faith, and in life. Their bond became a symbol of devotion and shared purpose. When she died in 2023, many wondered how long he would hold on without her. In the end, they left the world only a year apart, closing a love story that lasted more than 75 years. Their partnership was a reminder that leadership is not just about public accomplishments, but about the relationships that sustain a life of service. When Carter died, the United States honored him with a state funeral in Washington, D.C. Leaders from across the political spectrum attended, along with dignitaries from around the world. He lay in state in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, a tribute reserved for the most consequential figures in American history. Thousands of people lined up to pay their respects, some waiting for hours just to walk past his casket for a few seconds. The mourning period lasted a full month, reflecting the depth of his impact and the affection people felt for him. Even in his final years, Carter remained a symbol of resilience. He lived through health challenges, personal losses, and the shifting tides of American politics, yet he never stopped advocating for peace and justice. He continued teaching Sunday school well into his 90s. He continued building homes with Habitat for Humanity. He continued speaking out for the vulnerable. His life was a reminder that leadership doesn't end when the office does, that influence can grow even after power fades. Carter's legacy is not defined by a single moment, but by a lifetime of choices. He chose service over comfort. He chose humility over ego. He chose compassion over ambition. He believed that peace was possible, that justice was worth fighting for, and that every person deserved dignity. His life was a testament to the idea that leadership is not about being perfect, but about being principled. On this day last year, the world didn't just lose a former president. It lost a humanitarian, a peacemaker, a builder, a teacher, a man who spent a century proving that empathy is a form of strength. Jimmy Carter was born October the 1st, 1924, and he left this world on this day last year. December the 29th, 2024. He lived a remarkable 100 years. He held a life of service, a legacy that endures, and a reminder that the measure of a leader is not how long they hold power, but how deeply they touch the lives of others.